So if you are even remotely interested in the concept of personality typing, you probably would have heard of the term cognitive functions. These are terms coined by Carl Jung back in the dawn of the 20th century to explain essentially 4 different ways of processing information. But little do people know, this didn't start with Carl Jung. Carl Jung himself borrowed from many philosophers, and psychology as a whole has been understood through philosophy for many, many centuries. And many people would argue Carl Jung himself was more a philosopher than he was a psychologist. After all, back at the dawn of the 20th century, psychology was very much an early science. Heck, even nowadays, in the 21st century, I'd still argue psychology is a fairly early science. We cannot quantify things down to the minute detail and understand what's happening on a fundamental level in the same way we can with, say, chemistry. Rather, we tend to take a more symptomatic approach whereby we list people's traits and then they say, if you're behaving in this way and you're behaving in that way, you might have this particular disorder. And this is very much true for personality typing as well. Generally speaking, the concept of personality exists more on the behavioural realm of the spectrum than it does the cognitive realm. And as such, we have many applications of cognitive functions which are much more concerned with the behaviour a person is exhibiting than what's actually occurring within their brain at a fundamental level. And the problem is, when it comes to applying cognitive functions in order to understand a person's personality and what drives their cognition, and how cognition may differ from one person to another, what a cognitive function actually means in the first place is going to completely differ according to a school of thought's place within this behaviour-cognition continuum. And the general behavioural gravitation of cognitive function-based systems tends to stem from the fact that in order to get anything scientifically proved, you need to be able to correspond cognitive functions to a trait-based model. And this is why Myers-Briggs created the dichotomies within MBTI, because then cognitive functions could be directly correlated with traits, and traits can be observed within the behavioural spectrum. And therefore MBTI continues to occupy this murky middle ground whereby behaviour and cognition are sort of enmeshed together, and this itself yields the fairly low accuracy rating of this particular system. Because the fact is, behaviour cannot be directly correlated with cognition, at least not using a cognitive function-based model. And on the other hand, socionics tend to employ cognitive functions as traits in and of themselves, and therefore they can be measured. And as such, someone who is, according to the socionics version of cognitive functions, an ENTP, exerting as they do a strong extroverted ethics, alongside a kind of exploratory, hyperactive, extroverted intuition, may very much be, in every way, shape and form, an ENTJ within MBTI. And I'm sure another system will assign the person a completely different set of cognitive functions because this other system will have their own unique understanding. You see where I'm going here, don't you? The more systems you have employing Jungian cognitive functions, the more interpretations you have of what these functions are actually doing in the first place. Because that's the problem with the Jungian cognitive functions. They are highly open to interpretation. The more people you have creating their own systems, I say with no hint of irony, the more people you have employing a system but having their own unique take on that system, the more that you subdivide these various different interpretations, the more increasingly redundant cognitive functions become, because every single person has their own different understanding of what a cognitive function actually and intrinsically is. Let's take extrovert feeling, for example. Within socionics, that will be a behavioural observation of a person's interaction with the social atmosphere. Within MBTI, extrovert feeling will be a kind of social reciprocity. And within CPT, extroverted feeling is nothing more than the limbic understanding of emotional data outside of the self. And extroverted feeling and the role that it plays within a cognitive stack will differ completely between a more hardcore MBTI practitioner and somebody who employs the John Beebe model. And just as with Carl Jung's words themselves, this middle centre here whereby MBTI is agglomerating behaviour and cognition will itself have 1,000 different subdivisions and understandings of what cognitive functions are actually doing. Because the fact is, not many people are actually interested in what the cognitive function actually is at the very core. And part of this is largely owing to the fact that people are beholden to Carl Jung. In humanity, there is this strange phenomenon whereby after a certain amount of decades have passed since the term's conception, the person who conceived a term tends to become consecrated, tends to be heralded as a kind of superhuman, as a kind of messiah of their school. And as such, Carl Jung, this individual who is very much just creating new terms for things that have already been understood for centuries, is very much viewed as the unyielding authority in the subject, when in my opinion, I don't think he went that deep. And thus we have a situation in which a great number of typological schools are employing these things known as cognitive functions, while all of them having a very different understanding of what these cognitive functions actually are in the first place. And you'll encounter many an argument across the internet, across various academic schools of thought, whereby people belonging to one school of typological Jungian application are disagreeing with another person from a completely different school. And yet in this instance, they may very much be agreeing with each other in every way, shape or form, if it weren't for their semantic entanglement, if it weren't for the fact they were arguing using these terms under the pretense of them both agreeing in the first place about what these terms actually mean. When in reality, say, introverted intuition, according to this person, is implying a completely different meaning to that of the other person. And there's two different ways of solving this problem. The first one is to identify which specific school of thought a person belongs to. This person may be occupying a much more behavioral and symptomatic approach to cognitive functions, and this person may be much more cognitive in nature. And as such, once you've established these two positions, you then need to accommodate the differences in these two schools by interpreting the same word to have a completely different meaning according to the person using it. Introverted intuition, according to the cognitive practitioner, is going to have a completely different meaning to that of their behavioral practitioner. But the problem with this is it's very convoluted. You're going to have to, at the start of any kind of conversation between anybody employing Jungian typology, go through the lengthy process of actually agreeing upon what your terms mean in the first place. And agreeing to disagree about what the cognitive functions actually are at a fundamental level is going to have to be commonplace. Because otherwise, in the absence of a unified understanding of what a cognitive function actually is, you are going to have to, as an individual practitioner of an individual school, which itself may be an individual sub-school of another school, explicitly state what you mean by your own use of the term introverted intuition, for example. Because otherwise, the term that you are using is going to be interpreted completely differently by the person you are talking to, based upon the school they themselves might belong to. And it is largely owing to the sheer impracticality of this particular compromise that different schools of thought, different understandings of Jungian typological application, tend to wall themselves off into this elitist kind of exclusive fortress. Because within this small fortress, within this island, if you like, everybody has exactly the same understanding of what a cognitive function is, and therefore everybody can communicate with each other without needing to reconcile 1,000 different interpretations of what a term such as introverted intuition, extroverted thinking, for example, is supposed to mean. And as such, it's far easier for people to wall themselves off within their own little elitist community. And obviously within this scenario, everyone and their mother is holier than thou. One school of thought's interpretation of a cognitive function is obviously superior and more true, much more absolute in its truth than that of another system. Because the fact is, none of these schools are more right than the other one. Because what all of these different schools of thought have in common is that they employ a symptomatic understanding of cognitive functions. And the more the situation goes on and on and on, the more redundant the term cognitive function is going to be. And the more this entire school of understanding cognition and personality type is going to be the laughingstock of the entire scientific community, because nobody can agree on what cognitive function actually is in the first place. And the vaguer and more metaphorically charged any given definition of cognitive function is, the more this definition is going to be open to the interpretation of the individual. And thus, every single person under the sun is going to have their own interpretation of cognitive functions. And the less specific and scientific this entire field of psychology is going to become over time. And this is why CPT does away with the vagaries. This is why CPT throws all the metaphor and imagery and symbolism out of the window, because you don't need it. All it does is sow confusion into a topic that frankly doesn't need to be confusing at all. Because at the raw essence of it, it's actually remarkably simple. And as much as I advocate personality typing to move past the words of Carl Jung, I simultaneously must acknowledge that Carl Jung himself recognized the core essence of what cognitive functions actually are. And for whatever reason, for all the people consecrate the words of Carl Jung in regards to cognitive functions, his words on what these functions actually are at the very core seem to have been completely ignored. And what am I talking about here? I'm talking about the spectrums of rational versus irrational. The fact is, he had already created the blueprint for understanding what the cognitive functions are at their very absolute core. So if you split these 4 cognitive functions and their respective orientations in half, you suddenly have 2 cognitive functions, thinking and feeling in this instance, which are rational, and you have 2 cognitive functions, sensing and intuition, which are irrational. And this is where we get to the codecs and lenses of CPT. First up, let's take the lenses, because this is pretty important to get out of the way. Lens functions, perceiving functions, irrational functions, these functions have no rational agenda. They do not assign values to anything. If you are associating sensing with pleasure and intuition with patterns, you are already incorrect. At a fundamental level, they cannot be irrational functions if they are connecting things together based upon associations, because associations are dependent upon value assignment. You cannot, I say you absolutely cannot assign either of these functions a rational agenda, because they are not rational functions, they are irrational. They are the lenses of CPT. Lens functions do naught but perceive. Lens functions do not assign rationality. They do not assign values or associations. At the very core, absent an adjoining codec function, the lens function, sensing and intuition, do not, in any instance, of any way, shape, or form, assign values to that which they perceive. They simply perceive. Now let's take the codec functions. Now we can take the rational functions. Thinking and feeling do not perceive information. Extroverted feeling does not perceive external limbic data. Extroverted thinking does not perceive external, logical, objective data. Introverted feeling does not perceive your emotions any more than introverted thinking perceives your internal logical circuits. Rational functions do not perceive. They assign values to that which is perceived by the lens functions. 2 lens functions do not operate alongside each other any more than 2 codec functions. If 2 lens functions were operating alongside each other at exactly the same time, there would be no assignment of value. There'd be no understanding. There'd be no filter. Everything would be perceived, but nothing would be understood. If 2 rational functions, if 2 codec functions were operating alongside each other, the codec functions wouldn't have anything to work with. There would be no assignment of value, because assignment of value is predicated upon the perception of information. And this very perception can either be directed internally or externally. And this is where we get to the codec-lens relationship. Because both lens and codec must be employed alongside each other in order to create experience. Because experience is a simultaneous employment of perception and rationale. No matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter what your background is, no matter what particular form of existential philosophy you practice, there will always be a basic filter of what is meaningful to you, and your brain will always be forming associations according to what you are perceiving, whether externally or internally. Codecs and lenses always operate together. And this is where CPT departs from every single other system. Within CPT, a lens function must always be of an equal orientation to the codec to which it is assigned, and vice versa. And as such, within CPT, in no instances will an extroverted lens be employed alongside, adjacent to, an introverted codec. In no instances will an introverted lens be employed alongside and adjacent to an extroverted codec. And this is where we come to the convergent and divergent auxiliaries. A lens dominant type will always have a convergent auxiliary of the same orientation to the dominant function. And therefore an introverted intuitive dominant will either have introverted thinking or introverted feeling as the convergent auxiliary to the dominant function. And as such, owing to the oppositional nature of the cognitive stack, extrovert sensing as the oppositional function will always have an auxiliary opposite in every way to the convergent auxiliary. And this is where we get to the divergent auxiliary. Within the 9FJ, operating as they do using introverted intuition and introvert thinking within the dominant stack, extrovert feeling being the opposite of introvert thinking both in orientation and role, is subsequently the auxiliary to the oppositional function. And therefore there isn't this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 top-down list of cognitive preferences, rather there is a much more complicated and fluid interwoven map of how cognitive functions are interacting with one another within the mind of a given person. Extroverted intuition will never be employed alongside introverted feeling or introverted thinking, because you cannot perceive internal information without an adjoining lens directed towards the same place. And as such, an extroverted intuitive dominant will always have an auxiliary of the same orientation, will always have an adjoining codec of the same orientation to the dominant function. And as such, if you strive to understand what a cognitive function is actually doing on a fundamental level, you cannot in any instance ever divide cognitive functions into 4 or even 8 completely separate processing units, because you cannot perceive a codec without an adjoining lens. You cannot perceive information without simultaneously rationalizing it on some level. Extroverted sensing, for example, will never ever perceive pleasure. In this instance, extroverted sensing will be perceiving external objective data and then understanding that, relating that data to internal codecs of introverted feeling, accompanied with an introverted intuitive lens, in order to form the holistic experience of the cognitive stack. And as such, both an extroverted lens and an extroverted codec must simultaneously interact with an introverted lens and its adjoining introverted codec in order to form what is known as an experience. And as such, you cannot even divide cognition completely into pairs, because every single cognitive function interacts with one another. Every single pair of lenses of either orientation are going to subsequently interact with the next pair. An extroverted lens must always be adjoined to an extroverted codec, otherwise it would not be able to experience the outside world. And again, vice versa, an internal codec must always be accompanied by an internal lens in order to gaze at the frameworks or the limbic data it wants to quantify, it wants to understand and collate. Even in your dreams, there will always be an associative underpinning. There will always be values assigned to what you are perceiving. A cognitive function in and of itself is completely and utterly redundant, because it cannot do anything without an adjoining function of the same orientation and the opposing role to accompany it. And this is what's actually happening at the very core of the cognitive functions. There's no introverted intuition is mystical, there's no extroverted sensing is pleasure-seeking, because it's all entirely superfluous, and in my opinion, all of these stereotypes and misunderstandings about what the cognitive functions are actually doing at a fundamental level results from a low resolution and superficial understanding of what cognition actually is in the first place. And as such, for as long as we continue to rely on metaphorical and highly vague definitions of cognitive functions, and the more that we perpetuate this issue whereby every single cognitive function has 1,000 different interpretations, the more redundant the term cognitive function is going to become. And the more and more this entire field of psychology is going to be disregarded by the scientific community as pop psychology. And just as all areas of the brain behave synergistically with one another, CPT recognizes that this is very much the same with cognitive functions. And as such, the CPT understanding of the cognitive stack is faithful to the modern understanding of the human brain. And to conclude, if you perhaps exist on a more behavioral side of the typological spectrum, or if you personally just prefer the more kind of symptomatic approach to what cognitive functions actually are, fair enough, but just know that the more you employ that, the more you're going to have to contest with 1,000 different interpretations of the terms you yourself are using. And this isn't to say any other interpretation of a cognitive function is wrong. It is simply to point out that in the current state of this community's semantic entanglement, many people are going to be tripping up over their definitions, because nobody can agree on a single definition about what a cognitive function is actually doing and what it even is at a fundamental level. And I get it, not everybody wants to think specifically, and I'm not saying that it's necessarily a bad thing to constantly think in a holistic kind of metaphorical manner. But if you tread that road, you just have to accept the fact that everything is open to interpretation. So thank you so much for watching that video, especially if you made it to this point. You are awesome. If you haven't already subscribed, make sure to do so, and definitely click that bell icon below next to the button to stay notified of future content. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like. It really does help the channel grow, develop and reach new audiences. And be sure to share this video with anyone who you think might benefit from it. And just a reminder to you all, I do have a dedicated CPT type service available across 3 different tiers, so definitely check that out if you're interested in knowing what your type is, or even if you're just confused and you want some additional clarification on what your type means to you in the first place. And if you're interested in exploring any given cognitive function in more depth, or your respective type, or indeed the type of another person, I definitely recommend you check out the CPT ebook, and I also do hourly consultations over Skype as well. So again, thank you so much for watching the video, and I'll see you all in a few days. Take care.